Good afternoon. You have a couple of institutional welcomes here before the content that you're all here for gets started in a few minutes. I'm David Quigley, Provost and Dean of Faculties here at Boston College, as well as a professor in the History Department. Really pleased that so many of you were able to travel across the country to be with us for these 3 days for this critical conversation. In particular, I'm here to extend an institutional welcome on behalf of Father William P. Leahy of the Society of Jesus, Boston College's 25th president, who was a key part of planning for, imagining, then planning for, and then supporting this gathering. He was called over, as many Jesuit educational leaders around the world were, to a gathering in Deusto. At Deusto University in Bilbao, Spain, the Father General and Jesuit leadership worldwide convened a group of university presidents as well as intellectual leaders in the Jesuit higher ed world to come together for a conversation about the current state and the future of Jesuit higher education on a global stage. It's a very interesting companion piece to the conversations playing out here. There are many reasons why BC takes the work that you're engaged in today and on your home campuses and at your home institutions so seriously, partly because of that Jesuit tradition going back 500 years, the rich history and archival record that we are able to access, although with some pretty important lacunae, some disappeared archives over the centuries. That Jesuit tradition certainly inclines us to take seriously the work that you're engaged in. Being here in Boston, although I heard from a couple people that you've been pretty much rooted in the Rob Sham theater community for a couple days now, but being here in Boston, there's an orientation towards the past, towards thinking creatively and seriously about what history means. I think in particular, one of the striking things about Boston College, one of the reasons I found this to be such a welcoming home over 20 years and now in my 5th year as provost, is I think we're the only national university in the top 50 in rankings that has both a president and a provost who are card-carrying historians. Father Leahy has a PhD in American religious history. I have a PhD in American urban history. One cannot tell those stories. For me, the 19th century, for Father Leahy, the history of higher education in faith-based settings. We cannot tell our histories without the materials that you guard, that you shepherd, that you steer into the future, that we cannot tell not only those particular American stories, but the broader national narrative without the rich collections that you've helped to preserve and that you're thinking seriously about passing on as we go into the future. Boston College stands ready to partner both within the Jesuit fold, as we've been doing for many years, but with others arrayed around the room and others who are not able to be with us these few days, to think about opportunities for collaboration, for partnership, as my colleague Tom Wall will talk about in a moment, for digitization, for other approaches to making sure that that rich treasury, the blessings of the past that have been passed down to us, we're able to pass on to those next generation of individuals, teachers, researchers, scholars, Catholic lay women and men around the country and around the world. There's such a rich history that goes back in the collections represented around the room. And again, Boston College is very eager to see what the outcomes of these and related conversations are this year and over the next few, and to think about how we can work collectively for the greater good of Catholic America and of the historic record that we're trying to pass down, bringing new life to faith communities, to communities around the country. So again, on behalf of Father Leahy, my many faculty colleagues, Boston College community as a whole, it's great to have you here today, and we're very much looking forward to learning more when we receive word of the outcome of some of these conversations in coming weeks and months. At this point, let me turn it over to a good friend, our university librarian, who's been here for 10 years, who's done a really terrific job working with Christian DuPont, with the Burns collections, but with so many of our facilities on campus, building a team that is really thinking about the future of the library as a resource for the university community and the greater Boston public, and to some degree, the Jesuit community on the global stage in some powerful and very imaginative ways. So let me turn it over now to Tom Wall. Again, welcome.
So I'm also here to welcome you, but I've been told by David Horn that you've been here for a while, so this welcome is a little bit late. But on behalf of the libraries and all of the people who work in the libraries, as well as our friends in the academic side of campus, everybody who works on campus, welcome. We're really, really pleased to have you here, and we think that this conference adds a lot of value, and we are anxious and supportive, and going to be really looking for ways to collaborate and support your work as this continues to unfold. I'd like to talk a couple minutes, promised it would be 3, to talk about some of the things that have changed, and it'll give you some idea of how we think we can partner and facilitate your work as this thing starts to unfold. Our libraries, I came here in 2009, and the main library had about 650,000 people at the gate count, and this past year we hit 1.5 million. We did that mostly through transforming spaces and introducing new services. Are you guys getting an echo? Or have I just scared it up here? Okay. So that was something that was really important to us, but it wasn't just the main library. Many of you may have seen or used our Theology and Ministry Library, which supports the School of Theology and Ministry. They've gone up 92% in the last 5 years in terms of their use. And again, we're trying to engage our communities and try to, our motto is value beyond discovery. So our point has been to take what has been a traditional library where people, as a repository of books or archives, and make it so much more into a blended environment for teaching, learning, reflection, and any other academic activities that students or faculty are interested in. But we further recognize the social aspects of learning, particularly with this current generation. So we try and have that as part of how we think about our spaces. And we as a library have done some pretty cool stuff with the Association of Research Libraries, and we were the inaugural library for innovation and the innovation lab that developed within that community, which is the community of all the major research libraries in the United States and Canada. And that couldn't be possible without the support of the president, obviously David Quigley, our provost, the other deans, and the absolutely wonderful staff that we have here at Boston College Libraries. So we've really grown a lot in terms of the use of the library, in terms of foot traffic. We've grown in other ways too, and there's some things that people might on the outset seem to be counterintuitive. For example, our digital collections have grown close to 400%. We started an initiative that we actually partnered, well not partnered, but we saw that the digitization program and the archives in our special collections were treasures that needed to be put out there and made into something that could be used for teaching, research to a wider community. We also see part of that as advancing the Boston College brand. And the brand is reflected in a number of our collections, but two of the key areas are, of course, Irish, the Irish Catholic tradition, but also the Catholic Jesuit tradition. And those are our strongest holdings, and those are the things that we've paid most of our attention to with our digitization. There was a time when people thought the world, and you probably all lived through this as well as I have, that when Google came along and there was digitization, that libraries would go away. And in fact, it's been just the opposite. And we kind of think of our digitization program as adding bait, because our statistics have gone up as our digitization has gone up in terms of in-house use as well as digital use. So both ships, so to speak, rise with the tide at the same time. And we find this to be really an interesting phenomena. And the more you put out there, the more people are interested, and the more they come in and they discover it, they use it, and they want to see what else is there. And they want to work with a librarian or an expert, and they want to work with their colleagues. And we provide spaces for them to do that. One of the things that I'm most proud of is with the staff within the Burns Library, our special collections, is that we've transformed into a teaching library where we have many, many classes from many, many disciplines using our collections and our spaces in ways that had never really been thought of before. And this is a national trend, but we've become somewhat of leaders in this through our innovation work and with the Association of Research Libraries. And we've coupled that with a program around digital scholarship. So we use technology tools, we use original content, and we try and bring in with our students a sense of wonder and awe. And it helps with their formation, it helps with their obviously their academic world, but also, as David and Father Leahy appreciate, and any other historian, I'm sure all of you do as well, there's a sense of history that this stuff just doesn't appear. It's not just something you find on Google. There's a real life and history to these materials and these records, just like what you guys are talking about here. And we value that, and we want to continue to be, as much as possible, a part of the solution and support it in any number of ways. A couple other points I would like to make, and I won't take too much longer because I'm sure I'm at my 3-minute point here, is we do think that the world of archives is growing and continues. There's a lot of hidden stuff, right? A long time ago with special collections, there was this whole notion of the hidden collections and making them transparent and discoverable and describing them in ways that people can make relevancy judgments about them. We've taken that to task, and we see a real opportunity for all of you, and I'm sure this will come out in the conference and the white paper, to take that further. And one of the ways then, once you get the good description, we can also then create you could all think about it. We would be happy to see where we could support it, wherever, and it's through a partnership or a distributed model, whatever the model turns out to be, to see that stuff it becomes part of a database or a portal where a lot of people could find these things and go see what has to happen next. And that's really exciting, because this is the sort of stuff that really gets to the heart of what the world is for people who live the faith. And to us, that is critical to our mission. It's important to who we are, and it's important to this university and to us as a world of Catholics and people of faith. So I've probably talked long enough for all of you, but I really want to welcome you in a very sincere way. We have great facilities here on campus. We have great libraries, wonderful people, and we want to make your time here as valuable as possible, but also as stress-free and productive. So if there's anything we can do for you, please let us know. And on behalf of all the libraries and all the folks at Boston College, welcome, and thank you for being here.
So I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers for this next session. Our main presenter is Dr. Jean Bartunek, a religious of the Sacred Heart, who holds the Robert A. and Evelyn J. Ferris Chair in the Department of Organization and Management here at BC's Carroll School of Management. She serves as the associate editor of 2 journals, Journal of Applied Behavioral Science and the Academy of Management Review. Dr. Bartunek's primary interests center around academic practitioner relationships and organizational change. In addition, she studies multiple dimensions of the processes of organizational change, especially relationships between change agents and recipients, and interactions within and across these groups. One of her recent publications that seems especially relevant here is entitled Senior Managers' Sense-Making and Responses to Strategic Change. After our presentation, we will have 2 respondents. Sister Katie Hamm is a Sister of Charity of Halifax, a native New Yorker. She is serving her 2nd term in congregational leadership, and she has been in leadership since 2002. Prior to that time, she worked mostly in Catholic school education and parish ministry in New York and New Jersey. But in addition to these ministries, she has worked in a small high school in Brooklyn as a peace and justice coordinator and a volunteer coordinator for 2 Sister of Charity Federation congregations, and as an educator for Lifeway Network, an organization that works to end human trafficking. She is currently helping to get a book published entitled Steadfast Charity, did I get that? About the Sisters of Charity during the years of 1972 to 2002. And she notes that this work depends heavily on their archivist, Mary Flynn. Our 2nd respondent will be James O'Toole, who is the Clow Professor of History here at BC, where he has taught for the past 20 years. Prior to joining the faculty at BC, he directed the MA program in History and Archives at UMass Boston. Before he began teaching at the university level, Dr. O'Toole had an archival career at the New England Historical Genealogical Society and the Massachusetts State Archives. He then became the first professional archivist for the Archdiocese of Boston. He is a historian of American Catholicism, particularly interested in lay devotional life and religious practice. His most recent book is entitled The Faithful, A History of Catholics in America. So I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Maggie, thank you very much. I am very grateful for the chance to be here. I hope you noticed that Maggie didn't say anything about my being in any kind of leadership role in religious life. And to all of you who are in such a role, I just want to say thank you for your service. And I'm happy to leave it to you. Here are the origins of this presentation. The last 2 years, RICRI ran workshops for religious orders who were coming to completion. And I gave talks at both of those workshops. And the people in charge of this conference saw one, and they thought that maybe what I was talking about could be potentially related to all of you as well. The other origin of the talk is a former doctoral student named Ian Walsh, who has been very concerned his whole academic life with the important issue that organizations have important impacts on their members and their communities long after their legal death. And it's important to see how organizations live after their death. So if Pat referred to decline this morning, I'm also going to focus on what might seem to be death, but not so much. So, as Pat said, and I want to reiterate, I'm not an archivist. This is my impression of archives. This is my office. Anybody who wants, Margaret, Mike, anybody, when things pass, you can take away everything in my office except my personally autographed picture of Dolly Parton, my idol. So now that we have that straight. The people planning this conference gave me an article to read from American Archivist on documenting the spirit. And what that says is it's an archivist's job to collect, preserve, and make available for use documents that create a true picture of the past, but that also create a sense of the excitement and energy and spirit that was present in it. And I believe, yes, that's your job, but I think you have more of a job than that. I think you're not only documenting the spirit, I think you could be described as the chief collective memory and spirit facilitators for religious orders. But since I teach in a business school, I'm going to do something different. I am going to promote you to chief memory officers. You know, they're chief executive officers, they're chief financial officers, chief operating officers, chief information officers. But to the best of my knowledge, there are no chief memory officers or maybe chief preservation officers, but why not? And this is, actually, I'm saying this jokingly, but some of my friends who are familiar with archivists in regular corporations, they're not taken anywhere near as seriously enough. So one of the ways to do that maybe is to give you all a promotion. So for at least for the rest of the conference, that's your CMOs. So my purpose in this talk is to stimulate your imagination some about the importance of what you do and what it can include in terms of two things, culture and relationships. Let's talk about preservation first. That term has been used a ton. But what does preservation mean? If you were going to preserve fruits and veggies from this summer, probably you couldn't digitize them. it takes a lot more active initiative than this. It's done different ways. It takes creative, active work. And so I want to give you a different image that I think is actually beneath the surface here. And for those who are not at all familiar with baseball, I'm sorry, but I think you can get the image. Baseball umpires are the referees in baseball, and they are supposed to decide whether a pitch is a ball or a strike. So there's an old story about three baseball umpires discussing how they decide whether a pitch is a ball or a strike. The first said, "I call them as I see them." The second said, "I call them as they are." The third said, "They ain't nothing till I call them." But think of this as your role. Ann Carey has created the past future of LCWR. Now, I'm not saying I'm oversimplifying that, but she has been out in public and she has defined that. So what gets created as real is what people take the energy to create, to preserve, however it is they do it. And there's lots that could be preserved, far more than I know, but I want to focus on two things. One is culture. Culture is a very complex term that has all kinds of different meanings and implications. I'll talk some about that. And the other is relationships, in particular, relationships with people outside a community. And they can be all kinds of things. They could be conflictual, indifferent, positive, all of the above at different times, and so forth. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to describe some elements of something called a cultural toolkit, which I will explain. I'm going to explore a little bit about what relationship might mean in the context of archives. And then I'm going to tell some stories, 2 longer ones and 3 much shorter ones. The longer stories are about the Beguines and Studebaker. I mean, why not, right? The shorter ones are about 2 monasteries of a religious order and an educational setting. But let's start with culture. I'm sure all of you have heard the term culture talked about. I hear it in ways that say, gee, the culture of this university is good, the culture is bad, or we have a culture. How do you know we have a culture? Because we all go out for beer together at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. All kinds of things like that that are very vague without any specificity at all, but everybody thinks that they know what they're talking about. One way to talk about culture is it's a set of resources we draw on at different times to make sense of something. And here are some frequently used cultural tools: metaphors, images, stories, and material artifacts. And if you all are preserving a culture in some way, you're doing it in part by using tools like this. So let me explain each of them a little and then suggest that you just keep these in mind as I'm talking later. Metaphors could be something like, my congregation is like. People who join my congregation are Bavarian peasant women, something like that. And they're actually very important for providing meaning and stimulating emotion. So in a recent LCWR talk that some of you may have heard, Sister Mary Pat Garvin described religious leadership as graced companionship. I can promise you that nobody in a business school calls leadership graced companionship. It's all who has more influence than somebody else. In the Middle Ages, somebody whose name I definitely cannot pronounce said all kinds of wonderful things about cloistered religious life. It's a port of salvation, a shady place of refreshment, a bed of peace for serfs. Isn't that nice? Is that your experience of religious life? There are all kinds of images that are visual representations of culture. And although they're not just pictures, I'm just going to show a few very quickly to give some different images. This is, I guess, Mother Dolores Hartnell from Benedictine from Regina Laudis. This is her biography. Mother Teresa, you probably recognize. A Jesuit community a few decades ago. The recent edition of Nuns Having Fun. Some people, including a member of my congregation, Diane Roach, protesting about immigration. Some members of Giving Voice who wrote a recent book about the experience of young religious. Some LCWR and CMS protesters. Sister Simone Campbell, who's kind of an iconic figure these days. Some Dominicans being professed in Nairobi, and Father James Martin, who's also a kind of iconic figure. What meanings of and emotions about religious life do these images evoke for you, if any? Maybe none, but you sort of responded to Nuns Having Fun. None of the others, but stories are used to describe what is core to an organization. So I would imagine there are all kinds of stories that are told in your congregation, but they aren't entirely consistent. Sort of depends on who's telling the story. So one of the things I did once, a long time ago when I was consulting with a religious congregation that I wasn't familiar with, was at the beginning when I met with them, I said, could you please tell me a story from some time in your history that conveyed what's really central about you as a congregation? And could you tell me why? And they told me all kinds of great stories going back to the Civil War. And I had a sense, I have some sense of what really matters here. What are the themes that are here? I think the stories are core. I think people come with, I think oral histories are absolutely spectacular. Let me just give one example from a different setting, but I learned about last week talking with Mike and Schultz, that I think this is purposefully different, but maybe it could help stimulate some what might be going on in your experience. This is from Denmark. The story of the young son of the founder who proudly tells his father that he has only painted the wooden ducks twice that were going to Sweden, as opposed to the normal 3 layers, in order to save money for the company. His father orders him to take his bike to the train station, pick up the big box of ducks, add the 3rd layer of paint before going to bed. He ends up working all night and never forgets the insistence on the best. This is a kind of classic organizational story that gets passed down to new members. And I think it's worth it to pay as much attention as possible to what these classic stories are. Some classic stories, I want you to know, in some organizations are totally negative. They're not just heroic, aren't we wonderful? So material artifacts are the most tangible elements of culture. And I believe that a lot of what you're talking about with documents is by definition a material artifact, but they're actually anything non-human that you can hear, feel, or touch can be a material artifact that says a story about culture. Now, I'm just going to mention briefly the recent phenomenon of Sister Jean Dolores Schmidt, who is 98 years old, who is the chaplain of the Loyola of Chicago basketball team, which in March and April advanced very far into the National Collegiate Athletic Association playoffs. And she became a hero. Her Final Four press conference had a media horde, life advice, and an NBA burn. This is her. The press conference was completely jammed. All the other coaches had press conferences. Not that many people went. But more importantly, in terms of material artifacts, you could buy socks, her shoes, her bobblehead doll, and the team that Loyola played the last week of the tournament was the University of Michigan, whose fight song starts with "Hail to the Victors Valiant." And this was a sign that was posted in Ann Arbor. These are pretty, I don't know if any of you all have the material artifacts that are these exciting, but is anybody here from Dubuque by any chance? Pardon? Awesome. Talk to that lady. Okay, so let's now get into the serious stuff about the Beguines. And just as I continue, I'm not going to stop and say, hey, guess what? I just said a metaphor. I'm not going to do that. But I think hopefully you will see some of that. Okay, so I've got a good friend named Denise Rousseau, who teaches at Carnegie Mellon, who has been interested for years in the Beguines, and who was kind enough to get me on a dissertation committee in Amsterdam so I could go there for the dissertation defense and then go visit a Beguinhof there. This is one of the architectural outgrowths of the Beguines, with which you may or may not be familiar. But this is a picture of Denise there. This is a picture of one of the buildings there. I didn't know anything about the Beguines until Denise got me involved, but I've since then been very struck with it. It's a lay, quasi-religious, but definitely not nuns, order of women, who were mostly prominent in the Low Countries, like Belgium and the Netherlands, from the 13th to the 16th centuries, had a second wave in the 17th century due to a Belgian bishop, and who are sometimes referred to as gray women because they tended to wear gray homespun wool with hooded capes. The last Beguine formally died sometime in the 20th century, but she was the last one like by 50 years or something like that. So this is a group that is dead, sort of. Okay. Many of them lived by themselves, but they tended to include communities that had housing, and I've taken this from pictures of the Beguinhof in Amsterdam, that included a central church or chapel and an enclosed courtyard. It's very lovely space. It's off downtown. It's reserved housing now for individual women who make 16,000 euros a year. Those are the only people who can live in it. They're mass said daily in the chapel. So what has been created is a new embodiment in Amsterdam of a beguinage. So who are the Beguines? Just briefly, Laura Swan has written a book called The Wisdom of the Beguines that's worth reading. But they emerged in Europe in the 1200s as a merchant class was arising. And there was a very active movement called Vita Apostolica, as many lay people were trying to live the way they saw Catholic life described in the Acts of the Apostles. These were unmarried or widowed women living alone, or more often in beguinages. Some of them were probably widows of soldiers who went to the Crusades and died. They were financially self-supporting, they were active in the emerging money economy, but they were committed to serving the less fortunate, like lepers, for example, and they embraced apostolic ideals, especially poverty. They made a vow of chastity for the time they were Beguines. So once they stopped being a Beguine, that vow was no longer, it was no longer a vow. So, but they were kind of a problem for a lot of people, to put it mildly. I mean, it was really awful that they were leading, let's face it, it was really bad they were leading such independent lives. Women weren't supposed to do that. Women were supposed to depend on the guys. So this one particular Franciscan said, "They're among us women, we have no idea what to call ordinary women or nuns because they're neither of the world nor out of it, in the world or out of it, so what are we supposed to do?" And that was a good question. So very briefly, the first wave of Beguines produced a number of mystical thinkers and writers. This picture is of Mechtilde Magdeburg, in case by any chance you didn't recognize her. I'm sure it's a faithful portrait. But she was one of the best known ones. Another well-known Beguine named Marguerite Perret wrote a book called A Mirror for Simple Souls, which she had absolutely no business writing. And so she was called on to recant, and she refused to recant, so she was burned at the stake in 1310, which is a fate that I guess was sort of similar to St. Lawrence, right? The patron saint of archivists. They were, there was a lot of, they were accused of spreading heresy. I mean, they did weird things like read the Bible in the vernacular and preaching, you know, who could imagine that? So they were suppressed under Pope John the 22nd. They eventually were rehabilitated 100 years later, but then during the Protestant Reformation, a lot of them died, and there were just few segments left. So is this the end of the Beguines? Other than that one place off of downtown Amsterdam? Well, no. I want to describe some other contemporary offshoots. One of them is a Beguinage in Louvain. There was a Beguinage there that started in the 13th century. Over the course of the centuries, it fell into considerable disrepair. By 1960, it was in a deplorable state. Eventually, the Catholic University of Louvain purchased the site and restored it. And it is now recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. In fact, one of the members of my congregation, who's originally from the Netherlands, is living there this year. She sent me the picture on that picture, not the one with the bike. Here's another one, because that one's sort of, you know, like it's buildings. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this website. Take a breath with us, slow down and renew. Begin again is the vision of Methodist minister Terry Stewart, founded by her in 2008 as an interfaith platform for clerics and lay teachers to offer spiritual practices for renewal. 1peter5.com is a place dedicated to the Catholic ethos. The question is, the beauty of our faces is truly universal for all men at all times throughout the whole world. The 4 marks of the church are that it's one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, but sadly, in this present age, much of our unity has been lost. So this group is saying that the church is at a time of desolation, and what it needs is a new set of Beguines. And what these Beguines will do, there will be a place for them to go who love the Lord, feel drawn to a life of prayer and good works. They voluntarily pray for the church and the world and live a life of fraternal charity. There are the Beguines of Mercy in Vancouver, mostly lone lay sisters who devote their lives to good works. They're associated with the Catholic Church. I don't know if you can read it, but they have an interfaith focus suited to the West Coast, whatever that is. I mean, some of you probably know, but the West Coast is interfaith. There's another group in Germany. There are supposedly at least 25 Beguine communities in Germany. And what's important about these women is that they not that they're religious. In fact, this is secular. But they didn't want to enter a convent because they didn't want to live by these rules, but their way of life was independent and they could fend for themselves. The last and the version of Beguines that has gotten by far the most press, including in The Economist and Reuters, so maybe some of you have heard it, is a group of Beguines in California who make medicinal marijuana and sell it. And as you can see, they're certainly not religious, but they are Beguine revivalists. So notice, please, these are all offshoots of the Beguines. These are all contemporary manifestations of what somebody says is the Beguine culture. Beguines are very much alive. So how is the culture of the Beguines being preserved? A lot of ways, by a lot of different groups who don't know anything about each other, unless they, well, look at the web, but how similar are the contemporary manifestations? Not so much. I don't think the 1 Peter 5 group would have a whole lot to say to the weed nuns in California, or even to the ones in Germany. So to me, though, this is a fascinating example of preserving a future. It is being preserved left and right. Maybe not the way the founders had in mind. Actually, there's no certainty about who the founder of the Beguines was, so there's nothing to worry about that. But I think it's really interesting because it's saying that this group, this culture is still alive. So one question is, what's being done to preserve your order's culture? Switch to relationships. I'm going to talk about 2 dimensions of relationship, members and stakeholders. And I'm going to give an organizational definition of who a member is. Members of a religious community are anybody who share a sense of common identity and shared fate, member of an organization. That means, for example, that at least for the next day and a half, and for purposes of this conference, even if somebody is not avowed religious, if you're working with a religious order and have a sense of a shared fate with it, you are a member. Okay, so now you've just gotten 2 new identity terms. You're all members and you're all chief CMOs. But who are the stakeholders of a religious order? This is something I realized when I was working with the people whose congregations were coming to completion. They weren't always real sensitive to all the people with whom they worked. Stakeholders are anybody that has a stake in what happens. Whoever influences your congregation, who has a claim on its work, who receives it, who collaborates with it, who's a friend of your members, who say is in a diocese where it operates. So any religious congregation has a large number of stakeholders with whom we may or may not be aware all the time. So I want to give an illustration of relationships too. And I want to talk about Studebaker cars. And if nothing else, you could think of this will not be totally a happy story, so you could say, okay, this is about them, not about us. So just think about the relationships depicted in it. Here's a brief history of Studebaker, very brief. Founded in 1868 in South Bend. They started initially produced horse-drawn carriages. They entered the market for powered vehicles. So in case anybody never heard of Studebaker at all, let's just say it was a car company, okay? So by the mid-1920s, they were doing really well. But following World War II, they started to have labor and academic problems, management turnover, and poorly received products. And as a result of that, they closed down their automotive factory in South Bend in 1963. They had one place left in Canada until 1966, and then they shut down entirely. What impacts did it have when they closed? Unemployment in South Bend shot up dramatically. There was a sense of crisis in South Bend. A lot of people started referring to South Bend now as a ghost town, with the exception of one prominent football team that had a large university attached. There were a number of suicides and a fury of community members. Former employers blamed Studebaker's leaders for all the ways they had completely screwed up. So it was a dirty place to work, it was hard on your health. And so one of the things that started happening was that the buildings that were iconic to Studebaker started being torn down because people didn't want any memory of that awful company. Now, I hope when we have religious congregations come to completion, it doesn't have impacts like this. But this is actually serious. I mean, this was a huge impact. After several years, newspapers said, well, South Bend is scrambling back. Excuse me, do any of you live in South Bend right now? So, great. They can fill this out. Some citizens said, you know what? They actually had an impact, whether we like it or not. They're actually pretty important. And two groups had a big effect on how this got remembered. One was members of, there are Studebaker's drivers clubs all over. And they were, that groups that get together and drives 1930 cars and stuff like that. And they started saying, yes, but this is really important. We'd like to get together and drive our 1930s and 1940 cars. And another group that had a little bit of an impact were people who had a few stores stayed open that sold parts for Studebaker cars so that the Studebaker's drivers clubs could have parts. And one of the things they found was that Studebaker could foster tourism. So, gee, people, during the basketball season, somebody might come to South Bend to see Studebaker. Much later, social media enabled residents to say, oh, you know what, Studebaker wasn't as bad as it seemed. And they started to reconstruct Studebaker, not as a dirty place, but as an innovative automobile manufacturer. And they started saying this was an incredibly innovative company, which is important. And so there has been a revival of Studebaker. One of the illustrations of the revival is the Studebaker Museum, which is self-supporting, which holds their archives. And apparently it is, at least according to one of my friends who's a Holy Cross sister, says it's a great place. It's still possible to get parts for Studebaker cars. There are still drivers' clubs. If you look on the far left of the picture, the lower picture, you see a woman and a man. The woman is Bo Ramdeau, who's one of my students, one of my former students, who, with her husband, joined a Rhode Island Studebaker's Drivers Club for a while to see what it was like, and actually liked it. She was really intrigued by it. So, and actually, I started to think, if there's trouble finding places for religious archives, could there be something set up like a museum that could be a money-making venture. But I started to think probably selling auto parts and conforming drivers clubs probably wouldn't work exactly for religious congregations. I'm sorry, that's the only example I have. There's also Innovation Park, started at Notre Dame in 2007, which was a business incubator. There are a lot of those now to get entrepreneurs starting thinking entrepreneurially. Not to be outdone, South Bend launched its sister Ignition Park on the Studebaker land, so the places that got started to be think about by Notre Dame would have some place to go. And South Bend started to talk about itself as the city of entrepreneurs. This is pretty amazing. How Studebaker closed, they completely screwed up their relationships with other people. And this led to perceptions of them as incompetent and cruel. A few people took steps to preserve some parts of them. It took 40 years for people in the surrounding area to change how they saw them. But what has changed what has now changed is a completely different image of what Studebaker is. So this just raises a question for reflection. Who are all your members? Who are all your stakeholders? What are the relationships like between your state religious order and your stakeholders? And how is it evolving? Okay, now just 3 short stories. A Trappist monastery in Virginia preserving during diminishment, a Trappist monastery in Utah preserving during closure, and the former Barrett College in Lake Forest, Illinois, preserving after closure. Holy Cross Abbey is a Trappist monastery in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. The number of monks there has dwindled considerably. The abbey had a lot of land, and there were a number of problems with the land. The beef cattle being raised were trampling the streams feeding into the Shenandoah River. They were sending sediment into the river. The crops were being raised with harsh pesticides, and the community's buildings were old and leaky, and things like that. What might they do to preserve during diminishment? What they decided to do, and again, this is important to me thinking about preservation, was to take a number of sustainability steps. So they worked with a group from the University of Michigan. I heard about this some from Andy Hoffman, who's a professor there, and he was working with 6 master's students to make the land more sustainable. This went to a 400-page detailed report, so this was a big deal. I think you could get access to the report online. A large number of preservation activities that the monks paid for. And here are some of them. The most lucrative was an 80-acre natural cemetery in which people could be buried who did not have to be Catholic. They could choose to be buried simply in a shroud, the same way the monks are buried, or in a biodegradable coffin, or choose cremation and be scattered in a separate section of the monastery. They also created the non-denominational open-air chapel that's shown there. They renovated their own chapel. They created a conservation easement. They got rid of the old farmer and hired a new one. I think this is important, although I don't have the foggiest notion what it actually means. But whatever. I will leave it to one of you to explain this. It also led to an article in the National Geographic, a PBS documentary, which I think you could probably get, and a commentary in the Ross School of Business magazine by some of the master's students, in case you can't read it It's one thing to know your master's project has made a real difference in the world. It's another thing altogether to see it on the big screen and find out that the effect may have reached to the heavens too. So this, for me, is a really interesting example of preservation. It's not something being done in an archives, but it is very consciously preserving something something that's culturally important in the organization, in the monastery, and relationships. The Trappist Monastery in Huntsville, Utah, that was founded in 1947 with the arrival of 32 monks. The number had grown to 84 monks by 1960, but since then it has been declining. And you could read much more about these elsewhere, but I just try to get the idea. In 2013, Abbot Bernard Freeman was sent there basically with the idea that you've got to give last rites to the monastery. He was sent there basically to figure out how to do it, to sell the property, to help the remaining brothers accept the end of their monastic mission, and so forth. But it was important to them that they leave a legacy. It was very crucial to them that they leave some important, ongoing, living indication of what they were about. So they sold their land to a retired attorney who would preserve it as open land. The attorney worked with students at Utah State to develop a plan to preserve the abbey as open space. They also helped to build a Catholic church there, and they're trying to raise funds to create a conservation easement to protect it from McMansions and things like that. They also donated the money that they had made over the years to a shelter for the poor, needy, and homeless. And what they said was, we want the people of Utah to know that we're sad to leave them. We worked very hard to leave a legacy. And the new mural at Lantern House has some lines from the Rule of St. Benedict. So this is really important. They didn't just end, they left something that continues to grow. And it leaves a recollection of what they were all about. So, what cultural elements are they preserving? What relationships? Then the last example is preservation after closure. Barra College in Lake Forest, Illinois, was founded by my religious order in 1858. I promised before I entered, quite a bit. It was a small college, always, for a women's college, most of its time, eventually co-ed. It was operated independently until 2001, when it was no longer financially viable, in part because a president had decided it needed a new library, but it hadn't occurred to her to think that she actually needed the funds to build one before she built the library. And somehow they ran out of money. So a president of DePaul University thought, hey, this is nifty, we'll buy it and we'll call it Barra College of DePaul University. Not everybody liked it. Is anybody here from DePaul, incidentally? Okay, that's probably good. Because then somebody fired the president because they thought that was a bad idea. And so the trustee board decided, well, we're not going to, this is ridiculous. When we're in the middle of Chicago, what do we want to have this place in Lake Forest for? And so they voted to discontinue operating it entirely. But that wasn't the end. Actually, what got created by somebody who cared a lot about Barra was something called the Barra Educational Foundation that is aimed at primarily teaching elementary and high school students about government and civics. It's small, but it's ongoing. It also does things like maintain alumni and alumni lists for the college when there are reunions and so forth. It very consciously lists its mission as related to our order, as heirs of the legacy and educational tradition of Barrett College and its founders as the religious of the Sacred Heart. We do these things, and our core values are things very closely that are precisely taken from the core values of Sacred Heart education. So it has continued to be ongoing, creating something that is not being offered other places, and it's continued to be financially viable. So the question is, what cultural elements is the Barrett Foundation preserving? What relationships is it preserving? Okay, I'm going to give a very brief concluding summary. A religious congregation, partly through its archivists, preserves an amusing future in part by using tools like metaphors, images, stories, and material artifacts. Those are all important to preservation. But they're not the only ones who preserve it. Others who are in relationship with the congregation preserve it as well, and the quality of the relationship affects what's preserved. What was preserved about Studebaker initially was not something that the founders of Studebaker would have been thrilled about. And one final issue, so does time. Think of the Beguines going from the 1200s in some manifestation until now. Imagine you were the archivist for the Beguines in the 13th century. Think of how busy you would still be right now, how much you would have to do, and how much widely spread you would be. If you think you're spread now just because you've got 3 jobs, and think about, I maintain this group in Germany and the group in Vancouver and the weed nuts in California and all that stuff. So I think those are the most important things I want to say, is partly what you're preserving is culture and relationships. And these are some tools by which you do it. And I think your work is vitally important, and that's all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I received an email not too long ago that said I had the coveted spot on the program right after lunch, but it was really kind of a surprise that I'm here at all in terms of, it's my first conference. It sounded like I was in leadership ever since I was 12, but I was in leadership for 6 years, from 2002 to 2008, and then a 6-year break, and back again, 2014 to 2020. I'm here as a member of a 5-person leadership team of a small international congregation whose mother house is in Nova Scotia. But you heard, I live in New York. I'm from New York. I've been in New York. I went to Halifax for 5 years for formation, and other than that, it's been this crisscross path, trying to find out what our corporate identity is, trying to find out what our unknown future is. There are 2 things that I'd just like to start with related to our archives. In 1951, our second mother house burned to the ground, and we lost everything, but no life was lost. And so after that time, there was a substantial effort made to try to regain what was there. I'm in constant phone contact with Mary Flynn, who's our archivist, and she's said to me, the fire affects my work every day. While reconstruction efforts were substantial, there's still so much that's lost that we'll never get back. So it was something for me to hear her say that. I mean, I knew we have had a professional archivist since, I guess, the 2002 period of time. Mary's been in probably 4 or 5 years. But the archives have always been important to our congregation. Secondly, as to the work of the archives, I had to look it up, and it's on our website, and it says the mandate is to identify, collect, preserve, and organize. And my desk looks like Sister Jean's desk. And everything that pertains to the history, spirit, and growth of the Sisters of Charity of Halifax. And these include not only official papers, but administrative of the officers, but also the material that reflects the life and works of the sisters as individuals. So I start to say, what reflects the spirit of the Sisters of Charity of Halifax? What reflects the growth, and in this time of history, what reflects the letting go? Well, there is growth. Every stage of life, whether an organization or a person, has beauty and purpose. So the growth that's happening now is a deepening awareness of who we are as part of a federation, part of a Vincentian family. The awareness that we are part of religious life characterized by an acceptance of the new cosmology. For a small group of our sisters, the evolutionary consciousness movement, and all of us are working on trying to learn to discern through contemplative dialogue. And of course, an awareness that we are called to promote care of our common home. These are things that are growing in us even at this stage in our life. The movements that reflect letting go, there are lots of transitions related to representatives on boards, changes in leadership, so that even in this particular time of history, I have the title of canonical secretary, and they told me that really didn't require much work. However, I found out that it does require that I'm in connection with the archives and that I am aware of what's going on. So just to say, the other part that's required of us in terms of letting go is the sisters living constant change that requires a lot of flexibility. And when I talk to the ones that are 90, 96, and so on, they'll say, this has been our life. And I think that's true. And in the understanding of the kind of planning needed for whatever our unknown future is. Sister Pat this morning mentioned we use the term historical completion. I just would like to say that for several of us, the terms dying, diminishment, death, although it may reflect what the reality is, we use that word historical completion because the language of diminishment doesn't serve us. Every stage of life has beauty and purpose. So I came signing up saying, I want to find out what's next for the archives, what should be their holding place. And today I'm here to say that the real work of now is to find out and articulate the important stories and to build relationships with stakeholders. Sister Jean's talk really affirmed what I already believe, and that's that the role of leadership is, at least one of them, is to tell the story. And in a time when we are called to face the reality of coming to historical completion of this particular life form, for me, it's critical to capture the thinking, the wisdom, the learning, the inspiration that apostolic religious life may have to offer future generations. It also, to tell the story for our own sisters, affirms what has been done, and it plants seeds of hope in them. Sister Jean speaks of the cultural toolkit. all of this language, organization and archives is a new language to me. But the culture, of course, we've talked about the culture of vocation and the culture of this and that. So I understand the cultural toolkit, but she identifies it in terms of stories, metaphors, images, artifacts. I guess because I've been around so long, I entered in 1963, when it was the peak of our numbers, and here I am. Leadership 2002, 650 members. Leadership 2014, 2018, 260 members. So the change is happening, and it's happening before our very eyes. But I need to capture the stories now. And I've heard a lot of stories. From an inspirational point of view, the founding stories. If you think of your own stories, imagine they're quite heroic. I've heard of sisters coming to the United States from overseas and not being met by the bishop that invited them, so they had to find a place to stay, and that became their home base. In our own congregation, the Sisters of Charity of New York sent 4 of their sisters, and it was a time when they were experiencing a struggle with numbers, and the 2 bishops were friends, the Bishop of Halifax and the Bishop of New York, so they sent 4 sisters up to Halifax, and that was 1849, and by 1856, the Bishop of Halifax wanted his own congregation, and so the sisters from New York either went back to their own congregation or to another. We didn't even say our founding mother's name until about 1990, when we reclaimed the courage and the heroic activity of this Mother Basilia McCann. The overcoming obstacle stories, and you might say, what kind of obstacles? Well, you all have them too. They could be physical, they could be financial, they could be coming from within the church, from within the civil or business community, from natural disasters, the loss of members and institutions. Or you might have stories of the can-do spirit. One of the stories that I've heard a long time is about this little hospital in Manitoba called the Swan River. So I said, well, let me look up the facts about Swan River. Well, today, Swan River has 4,000 people. It has winter from November to April. The stories that the elderly sisters were telling me they didn't even want us there. We were Catholics. They didn't want us, so they went in kind of on the sly, and they came to be a beloved fixture in the community. So those are stories that are of obstacles. Among the joys of leadership, talking to individual sisters, I asked the centenarian on her birthday, she was 102 then, I think, but she still could, function. I said, tell me, what do you remember? And she paused, and I'm waiting for some great story, and she says, it was a hard life. Okay? And we all know the details that could make us shudder. But for some, at least, this person, she stayed and she flourished. She was known for her kind of joy in living. So that's the stories that, could be told. There are also stories from a learning point of view. We could learn from those. But we asked individual sisters, what's your greatest joys and disappointments? Some of them had to do with, changing the habit and the loss of respect of people that they served. Some of them had to do with actually moving into a public nursing home when they never thought that was happening. That's when we sold our 3rd mother house in 2007, and it was deconstructed. I put down I'm sure if you read American Magazine, then you may have read the article that's by Eileen Markey called The Whitewashing in Canada. And that story tells the story of the residential schools. And it's our story. It's a story that we've all kept under the table for a long time. But In this story, Donna Gernhardt, who was our former leader, says, and she works in this process now of truth and reconciliation, "We were co-opted into a system that was racist, but we didn't see it at the time. We see that we have an inheritance of hurt and injury that has harmed others, and for that we are sorry." And she said, it's a heritage of guilt, if you like. The story of truth and reconciliation and our own part in it is not finished. It's probably at the very beginning stages of admitting it and living with the shame. Maybe living with the accountability that things can't be that way again. And of course, it's only one piece of where that kind of story exists. It just happens to be now quite public and is part of a larger process within the Canadian culture, and it could be in part of our culture, as we all are studying racism in the LCWR. So there are stories that can't be lost, because that's part of us too. When I thought about images and metaphors, I was kind of thinking, we've changed a lot along the way, but let's say in my time around, disciples on the road to Emmaus, that was us, all was on the journey, The basin and the towel happens to be, the one that we use as our medal that says, we're people of service, that Vincentian charism. We even recently used nurse logs. Never heard of them before, but you've seen them before. In the forest, when the tree falls down, new life springs out of that. New life comes out of that. So we're creating new metaphors about what it means to be who we are now. So I can say for sure that there are many, many more stories that we could talk about, many more metaphors, but I think it's just, this response is just meant to be a beginning of a further conversation. In our own congregation, it was considered a compliment to be tough, independent, laser-focused. Now we'd like to add compassionate and kind, and we probably were. but the other ones were put up higher, given more of a priority. We had sisters in 1906 that went to Oxford to study because we were starting a university, well, it was a college at the time. And when I thought about it, 1906, going over there and studying, getting your doctorate, I thought they were pretty brave. I thought they were, and it was probably far-sighted that those kinds of things happen. And sisters were sent to Peru, Dominican Republic, and the stories of those early days, their camaraderie among all the missionaries there. And I went once to visit, and I was just kind of awestruck with the stories about living in, I don't know if they're buildings, but places where it was made out of hay, and the hay had bugs in them. And that was all I needed to know. I was not meant to be a missionary. But the missionary component of our sisters, they changed who we are, because whenever we served, we learned. We changed ourselves. So service was the key. I guess I'd like to say something about, we were pretty, I guess, smart in a time when women didn't, buy land, construct buildings. They were in charge, and they got these things done. Simone Campbell's picture was up there, and I really love that she capitalized on the idea of nuns on the bus, right? And nuns on the ferry. Nuns anywhere together are powerful, and they stand for those who don't have the voice and who don't have the power. So I guess I'll just share one more of our stories, and that's this is an operetta that was written in 2014. It's called The Time of the Trouble. So this is the libretto of that operetta. Now, if you go back to what was happening in 2014 in religious life and the church hierarchy and things like that, the visitation, I don't know whether that triggered this man who composed it, but it's a story of our life in the 1870s when the Bishop of Halifax wanted to exercise more control than the sisters thought he should have, and therefore the sisters went over to Rome, and we became a papal institute as a result of that. So whether that's good or bad, that's the way it was. So we have an operetta that was researched in our archives. I asked Mary, well, what did he look at? She said, well, besides the straight history, he looked at the songs and prayers that were used at the time. And if you ever saw the operetta, you'd hear the Gregorian chant, but you'd also hear the dissonance of what was going on between the parties that were involved in the conflict. So, just to say, the archives, hold a lot of stories, and some of them will be used by artists, and that will influence other people too. I guess just to jump over to stakeholders. So stories, stakeholders. Those are the two things I'm taking home. I've used the word stakeholders a lot. I don't think I've thought about it creatively very much. So when I thought about us, I said, well, we're women. We're women who always wanted women to be independent, and whether it's Catholic college, whether it's shelters for domestic violence, education, whatever it is, we really believe that women and children are a focus that's important. So I said, well, where are the stakeholders? Who are the people that might care about the values that we had and the work that we did? And so I started to try to think, easily I came up with associates, our partners in mission, benefactors, friends. Then I went to, well, maybe women in the church, if there's still women in the church with our millennial results, who knows. But maybe communities in need of truth and reconciliation, maybe we'd have something that they could use. Global citizens, activists on behalf of the earth, the human community. And we might have something to offer if we have archives that are preserved. Then I thought, well, maybe more possible stakeholders by geography. Because maybe who cares what happened in Nova Scotia but Nova Scotians? So I said, well, could be people who are storytellers of North America, storytellers of the Canadian church, singer-songwriters. I said, who will care about our story? Who might have a stake in it? Do we just see ourselves as having, an audience within the church or the institutional church, or is it broader? Is it women? Is it women pioneers? Is it women activists? Who are we saving it for? What riches are there? What's there that might be possible? People with a common vision, storytellers of institution created in response to needs. That's what we always said. Whatever the needs are, that's what we want to respond to. People with a common challenge, people whose institutions may be on that spiral of completion. And then I always like this term, I don't know if we ever are actually it, but they call them edge walkers, people on the margins, people who walk from the margins and see things from that angle. So there will always be people who walk on the edge. Will we have something to offer them? How do we know what qualities will be important to them? Well, I particularly like the quote that Sister Jean said, the quality of the relationships affects what is preserved. And if I were to say what is one thing besides the stories we should focus on, it would be to actually develop an idea of who are the stakeholders and how do we establish relationships now. So I went back and I looked at one of our ministries that we are not really associated with in any financial way or sponsorship or anything like that anymore. But in 1987, there was a ministry in Lawrence, Massachusetts that was called the Elizabeth Seton Asian Center. And I looked at the website. That group is now called the Merrimack Valley Immigrant and Education Center. So how did it get from Elizabeth Seton Asian Center to the Merrimack Valley? And the thing was, the first sentence in this says, the sisters, or it doesn't say sisters, but the founders went around and listened to people to see what they needed. Well, that's an ongoing value that I hope all people who want to help other people, do that, so that they're listeners. And then the Elizabeth Seton name, I guess, didn't have enough weight to it to get grants. So the executive director and the board said, oh, we better change that. We'll change it to the Asian Center of Merrimack Valley. And then, because the times have changed, it's not the Vietnamese or Asian people that needed it so much as also Hispanic-speaking people. So that's why it had a broader name now. But the legacy that we want to leave is not the name, or even our founder's name, but the charism. The desire to serve, especially those who are in need of it. So what will I do as a leader? I think sometimes people have an exalted idea of what leadership can do. But what we can do is have conversations that matter. And everything takes such a long time. But I think that it's the leader, the archivist, communicators, I would say artists, any stakeholders that we can imagine, start trying to say, who do we need to gather and talk about this with? It won't be any good if we just talk around our table and figure it out. It really has to be a broader sense of who cares and what is it that's important. I appreciated the ideas that Sister Jean had, and I'm going to encourage our team. That's one thing. It's like, where can you have influence? So wherever you can have influence, that's who you want to gather. And I like the words that Sister Jean gave to the archivist, the chief collector of memory and the spirit animator. And that's what they sometimes say about leadership. You hold the memory. You also are to animate the spirit. And so, in truth, I can see that it's with the archivist only that this can be done in the best way. So I'll put it on the agenda. I'll share the ideas from the conference. I'll hope that we get some ideas and we put them on a timeline, because that means they're really going to happen if they're on a timeline. And we'll just try to keep trying to actually do something concrete, I think, to improve the quality we have with the various stakeholders. So thank you.
It's too late for me to add my words of welcome to Boston College. I think you've probably already been welcomed enough. The participants in this conference, I think, will not need to be convinced that religious orders do indeed have a culture, a charism, to use the traditional religious language, or that this culture is essential to understanding what its members do and why. Nor do we need to be persuaded that it's crucial to preserve that culture, however intangible it sometimes can seem, or that preserving the evidence of that culture is an important work, even, or maybe especially, in the face of what we have learned today to call completion. The framework that Jean offered for understanding the constituent elements of such a culture, stories, metaphors, and so on, has been a very helpful one. For archivists, of course, the specific responsibility is to focus on those material things that she itemized, including first and foremost the documentary heritage of a religious community. In general, over the last 40 years or so, the archivists of Catholic religious orders particularly those of women religious, have been doing this with some considerable success. Diocesan archives, too, I might add. Taking advantage of widespread interest in things historical in the 1970s, prompted by the bicentennial of the American Revolution, archivists have worked with community leadership and diocesan officials to establish programs for the care of archival records, and they've been eager to make those records available for use by scholars and others. Now, none of these archives most likely have everything they might wish for in terms of space, budget, staff, cooperation. Sound familiar? But what impresses me most about these archives and this archival effort over the last several decades is their ongoing and continuing nature. Interest in archives was not, in most cases, a one-time thing. As one archivist retired or went on to other work or, yes, died, a new archivist was usually appointed to take their place, and that is very good. Those who did not have previous experience in archives acquired at least basic training and education through workshops, participation in professional associations, and so on. All that, I think, has helped ensure that the work of caring for records has come to be understood, properly so, as a core institutional responsibility, like the professional management of finances, personnel, property, and so on. Religious orders have lawyers, and they have accountants, and they have archivists. These archivists have worked to preserve essential administrative records, those records having what used to be called evidential value. But archivists have also appropriately had an eye toward those things that help us get our arms and minds around that intangible culture or charism of each group. You know them probably better than I. Constitutions, chapters, formation documents, editions of the rule, photographs, examples of the habit. All of those and more, regardless of form, help archivists approach the difficult work of documenting the spirit. The question before us now is how to continue to maintain this documentary heritage in the light of the changes in religious life that are already well underway in the face of organizational shrinkage. We all know the numbers. From my own quick survey of all the terrific documentation that Cara assembles and makes available, two recent data points stand out. First, in the year 2000, less than 20 years ago, there were about 20,000 religious order priests and brothers and 80,000 religious sisters. While in 2017, last year, there were 15,000 priests and brothers, 45,000 sisters. 2 decades, priests from 20 to 15, sisters 80 to 45. Second, and more portentous for the future, in 2017, roughly 80% of religious institutes reported that they had no professions of perpetual vows. None. Given all that, how do we ensure the preservation of the archives and therefore the memory of the work that these institutes have done, work that has been and continues to be so important to the history of the Catholic people? Moreover, what can we do that will at least make it possible for that historical memory to be applied to the future and in the future as new forms of religious expression emerge, as I believe, as a matter of faith, they will? I have to believe that the Holy Spirit has something in mind. Come back in a couple of hundred years and we'll know what that is. Many of you here have already been involved in addressing these issues, and this conference is a good opportunity to hear some examples of what's been done and to brainstorm how some of those general patterns might be applied in particular circumstances. There have been a number of instances we know of religious orders placing their archives in a related institution. We heard last night of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, now in the Philadelphia Archdiocesan Archives. And the records, I checked the website, more than 800 boxes of them, of the records of the Mission Helpers of the Sacred Heart, now in the archives at Catholic University. Such arrangements have to be done carefully, with appropriate attention to legal custody, the protection of privacy and other individual rights, terms of use, and other matters. It is, I think, useful to hear of such efforts, what others have done, and how that might or might not apply in a given community or situation. That's the kind of conversation that this conference can prompt. One size will not fit all. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. To be sure, there are potential problems with any such arrangements, and for what it's worth, let me offer some caveats. Personal opinions clearly labeled. I am suspicious, and I think you should be too, of outside archives that seek out new acquisitions more aggressively than they subsequently organize and care for them. Institutions that are, in the words of an early archival mentor of mine, all ingestion and little digestion. I'm suspicious, and I think you should be too, of single, centralized national archives for religious communities. Not opposed, just suspicious. These arrangements can be appropriate depending on the order, but they can also remove records from the immediate institutional surroundings that produced them. And they can greatly reduce the likelihood that archival records will be applied, as I believe they should be, to matters of current-day administration in the religious community. I am suspicious, and I think you should be too, of people who present themselves as quickie archival consultants, who offer easy solutions, let's just digitize it all, to complex problems. They should be chosen carefully. Caveat emptor. Finally, any acquiring archives, such as that of a university, will have its own responsibilities to discharge, its own problems of program definition, budget, staff, space, and so on. It should therefore resist the temptation to bite off more than it can chew. All that notwithstanding, these options are worth exploring. One final thought, prompted by Jean's description of the closing of Barat College and its affiliation with DePaul University. Hearing about that made me think of, this might surprise you, Radcliffe. You know Radcliffe. Established at Harvard in 1879 as the Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women, informally known as the Harvard Annex. Women in the Annex, typical. In 1894, it was reincorporated as Radcliffe College, providing undergraduate education to women at a time when all Harvard students were male. In 1975, women were finally admitted to Harvard, but the two institutions continued their separate, if connected, existence. And finally, in 1999, the two merged, and Radcliffe was transformed from a college into an institute within Harvard, sponsoring research fellowships and other scholarly and public programs. A key component of that institute, I should say, is the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women, probably the best and most significant collection of archival materials on its subject anywhere in the world. Can we think about establishing somewhere a comparable institute that focuses on Catholic religious orders and their work? I know that some orders have their own individual heritage centers, but I'm thinking of something broader. It might be freestanding, or more likely, housed in a university, in particular one that had successfully worked with communities and their archives. In this way, it would be a center, not the center, but a center, for preserving the culture and charism of religious life. It could cooperate with and perhaps become the institutional home of the Triennial Conference on the History of Women Religious, which has helped encourage so much important research for many years now. It would need its own funding, which might come from the parent institution, from contributions by the orders whose archives are maintained there, from potential granting sources, from private donors. It would need oversight and support in the form of trustees or advisors chosen from a range of Jean's religious community stakeholders. This institute could offer research fellowships for students at all levels, for scholars and members of religious orders themselves. It could assist in the publication of scholarship, and it could plan public programs that brought awareness of the work of religious communities to a wider, non-scholarly public. I'm picturing here a visit from the C-SPAN city tour bus one day. I haven't thought this idea through to any extent beyond what I have just said. But it's worth exploring, I think, and I'd be happy to do that with anyone interested. It's already become a theme of our conversations over the last day that Catholic religious communities are at a turning point, and that the preservation of their archives, and therefore of their work, is an urgent task. We should not, I think, be looking for the answer. Rather, let's multiply the possibilities, learning as we go. I'll say it again, thanks to Chairman Mao, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Thanks.
Malachi, can we take a couple of questions? Do we have time for that? Okay. Yeah, if you folks want to come back up for a minute, well. This was possibly the best after-lunch session at a conference ever.
Could you speak from the mic? We can't.
I'm sorry. We're going to take a few minutes of questions. We know we're running late, but we've got some time, I think, built in. So, again, if you'd come to the mic, that would be great. Oh, I made them all come back up here, so.
I have a question of Sister Hamm. Were your archives actually totally destroyed or not? I'm not clear what you said. The fire.
Yes, they were. The first step after that was the sisters and volunteers, I guess at the time, went to different resources to try to get the same information, and the Federation members at the time all contributed a piece of something from the founder. So that was the beginning of the rebirth, I guess, of the archives of that time.
I was just thinking that. Margaret or Mike, do you know? What happened to the Barrett College archives? Yeah, they were. Where's Mike? Yeah. Oh, do you know?
We don't have them. I think they're at DePaul.
Okay.
I believe they were at DePaul. I had visited Barrett College the year before. I think it was assumed by DePaul, and had finalized a separation of what were congregational records from the Barrett College institutional records. And I believe I was at our archives of the USA province then when the sale took place, or when the end of Barra took place, and we received nothing. So it must have been all institutional.
I think that's raising a really important point. If someplace gets acquired, as maybe somebody knows here, as Newton College of the Sacred Heart got acquired by Boston College, I have no idea what happened to the archives.
They're here.
Okay, good, thank you. Ask you need any of the Newton College archives, ask Jim. Or David. Yeah.
I want to thank Sister Jean for coming from another disciplinary area of academe and showing us how to apply that in another way. That usually brings very rich cross-fertilization, and you've given us things to think about. So I appreciate the approach, which is very much from the outside, but then coming in and saying, okay. And Jim, I thought some of your ideas were amazing. I'm someone who, and I shared this with my group this morning, that believes let's look at a large piece here. Let's look at thinking about this in a large way. And I agree with you, not only that one size doesn't fit all, but the idea that this won't be the fix, but it will be a very important fix. And I think in a very large, it could be very large and dramatic with some of the things you outlined within the institution, because it hits the factors, but at the same time, the smaller, it could have a broad umbrella effect. And so I guess I'm hoping what comes down the pike from this, and I'm hoping we can leave here with some very specific ways to at least think about, not a definitive decision, but I would like to explore this. You said I'll talk to you, and others, because I really think this has some real meat to it, and it gives everyone in this room, all of us working in some way in this picture, we need a big screen here. We need a big area, because if it's going to make the impact, whether it's for the stakeholders or your cultural piece, whether it's communities that you also shared with us, we need a big canvas, because when we do that, that's the way then to put out a very large, enduring message about the importance of what has happened and the importance of women's and men's religious communities, not only to the American Catholic Church, but to the United States of America and the larger American narrative. And that's, I think I mentioned last night, what got me into this area in the first place, because I don't have the pedigree of most of you within your areas. So I come to this as an outsider, but I really think it is one of the most important, meaningful endeavors that I would like to be a part of. So I just wanted to encourage all of you in that.
So I have a quick question concerning after the fire. Do you have a disaster plan in place now? So after the fire, after the lessons learned, do you have a disaster plan in place now?
What happens if you have a
Is there a plan? Because as we're all thinking about places that are nearing completion, that really is the disaster plan. What records do you want to live forward, that if you had a chance to save them, to continue to tell that story, what is it that you want to tell? So looking at what you lament on what you lost helps then know where you want to go if you're still leaving that footprint behind. So I still encourage everyone to still have a disaster plan, but that's another actual way of looking at what are you preserving and why.
Yes, thank you.
Any final questions or comments? Malachi, what time do you want people back? Okay, so 3:45 up in the Commons. Right, not the big room, but the other room. Okay, thank you all very much to our panel.